This video is sponsored by Squarespace. More about them in just a moment. Religion has been one of the hot topics of humanity since arguably the dawn of civilization. For many people, the whole reason they got into philosophy or philosophical debates is to answer this key question: does God exist? And recently, I've seen a number of videos online going through religious arguments one by one to give a sort of semi-comprehensive list. However, I want to take a slightly different approach. In this video, I want to explore the different types of religious arguments and the potential ways that someone can challenge them, so that you can use this not only to categorize any arguments you already know, but also any novel ones that you'll then come across. Think of it as a user's guide to arguments about God. Get ready to learn the relevance of religious experience, whether you can prove God using logic, and whether God remains useful even if he does not exist. Now, obviously, this is a massive topic, and I'll be skimming over a lot of the fine-grained detail in the arguments. Think of this as more of a pragmatic guide than a rigorous philosophical typology. And I want to begin with some of the best-known, but also most controversial, religious arguments. But before any of that, I want to thank the very kind sponsor for today's video, Squarespace. If you're looking to build a website, then you know it can be a real hassle. First, you need to find the domain name and then construct the whole thing. And then there's always the underlying fear that you are messing up and creating something that's not only untidy, but outright unprofessional. But this is where Squarespace is immensely helpful. They compress all of that into a single platform and use ready-made templates to take most of the complication and headache out of website building. They also have a feature called Design Intelligence, which uses AI tools to help you make design choices, which is really handy if, like me, you're not necessarily that technologically gifted and don't have the eye of a graphic designer. Head to squarespace.com/unsolicited advice and use the code unsolicited advice to get 10% off your first purchase of a domain name or a website. But anyway, back to God. 1. God of the definitions. The phrase a priori is a technical term from philosophy that just means from before or prior to experience. Labeling something an a priori argument essentially means that that argument does not rely on facts about the outside world to function, but is rather argued for on purely logical, metaphysical, or definitional grounds. That is a bit of a mouthful, but there are some very intuitive examples. To take a non-religious one, if you asked me to justify why 2 + 2 = 4 is true, then I would probably do so by saying that it is just part of the definition of the number 2 that when it's doubled, it makes 4. If I was being more precise, I could point to the axioms of piano arithmetic and say that in that arithmetical system, it would be contradictory to say that 2 + 2 is anything other than 4. And since that is the system we use for our everyday calculations, it follows that in almost all normal arithmetical circumstances, 2 + 2 = 4. If you know some of the exceptions, then do leave them in a comment, as they are quite interesting. If we look at my argument, my justification here is a priori. I did not try to justify my belief by pointing to sticks on the ground and adding them up or anything like that. Instead, I purely used the definitions of the terms involved and didn't draw from experience at all. And just like this, there are some religious arguments which claim to prove God's existence from first principles. One very famous instance of this is the ontological argument put forward by Anselm. Here, Anselm argued that God must exist because of the definition of the word God. He starts by defining God as the maximally perfect being, possessed of every kind of goodness and greatness. That is, he is perfectly kind and perfectly loving and perfectly powerful and perfectly wise and so on. But then, Anselm says that in order to truly be the perfect being in every way, God must exist. After all, say we were comparing two situations, one in which the being with all of these other perfections was imaginary, and another where it truly existed in the world. Which would be better? Well, Anselm thinks it is clearly the one that would exist. Thus, purely by looking at the definition of the word God, Anselm thinks God must exist, since a maximally perfect being would exist by definition. This is a classic example of a purely a priori argument. Anselm has not invoked any sort of observation or fact about the world, but rather simply argued from his definitions to the existence of God. Another example of an a priori argument would be the modal ontological argument. To give just one very brief version of this argument, this claims that if God exists, then he must exist necessarily, and if God does not exist, then he must be impossible. This, again, is based on a complex series of claims about the definition of God, which I won't get too into here. But then we are left with two options. Either God is impossible or he is necessary. Most people tend to think that God's existence is possible and thus not impossible. And so if the only two options are impossibility or necessity, then he must be necessary. Then, since all necessary things must exist, God must exist. The common thread which binds these arguments together is that they do not start with some fact about the world we observe, but instead appeal to definitions, metaphysical principles, or attempts at deductive reasoning to try to prove the existence of God. This is another really interesting component to a priori arguments for God. They tend to conclude not just that there is some amount of evidence for God, but rather that God definitely exists. To that extent, they are much more ambitious than almost any other religious argument. Though I suppose that, in theory, you could have an a priori argument for God that didn't have a certain conclusion. Say one based on judgments about probability that weren't come to through experience. It's just that I haven't come across one. To analyze an a priori argument for God, we first need to know whether it is attempting to argue from definitions or from some metaphysical principle. Then, we can either challenge the specific definition or principle, or, especially in the case of definitions generally, challenge their ability to give us an insight into genuine truths about the external world. For instance, Anselm's ontological argument has been criticized by saying that existence is just not the kind of property that can feature in definitions, and that, as a result, it simply is not valid to infer anything from definitions to existence. This is sometimes called the claim that existence is not a predicate. Alternatively, in a famous response Anselm received by another monk, he argued that by the same token we could say that the perfect island must exist, because an existent island would always be more perfect than a non-existent one, and the same for the perfect sandwich, and so on. Sometimes this argument is put in terms of perfection, and sometimes it's put in terms of greatness. I've used the version in terms of perfection because it seems to just crop up a bit more in recent discourse. Some thinkers, like Bertrand Russell and David Hume, have argued that we simply cannot infer anything a priori about the world, since well-structured a priori reasoning must be deductive, and deductions can only conclude things that are already disguised in their initial premises. If you hold this view, then any a priori argument for God would be doomed from the start, since it would be necessarily assuming God at the outset. Again, to use Anselm's argument, this criticism would say that the perfect being must exist is just another way of saying God must exist, and so the argument is circular. But the main thing to remember is that you are dealing with an a priori argument for God, when the argument attempts to infer the existence of God from definitions or metaphysical principles that can purportedly be known without any reference to the contents of experience. It's also worth noting here that you can have a priori premises or logical moves contained within an argument that is a mixture of a priori and a posteriori reasoning. But this is just one type of religious argument, and the next one is a mirror image of a priori argumentation that is, rather appropriately, called a posteriori argumentation, or arguments from experience. If you want to help me make more videos like this, then please consider becoming one of my wonderful patrons to support the channel. The link is in the description, and I would really appreciate it. 2. Experience and religion. Almost all of the reasoning we do on a daily basis is some kind of a posteriori argument. That is, an argument from observation or experience. When we assume that the shop will be open because it's normally open at this time of day, that is an a posteriori argument, as is almost all scientific inquiry. And a huge number of theologians throughout history have thought that there is evidence for God all around us in the world, or through particular supernatural events. Maybe the most common type of argument in this family would be the field of natural theology. This attempts to infer from some set of facts about the natural world to some conclusion about the nature or existence of God. A well-known example of this is William Paley's design argument. Paley starts with an undeniable fact about the natural world, that it contains immense complexity, and says that in every other case that we come across something of similar complexity, we infer that that object must have had a designer. For instance, if we were to stroll along the beach and find a watch on the sand, we would not think, oh, I wonder how the tides and wind made this watch. We would instead think, I wonder who made this watch. This is an a posteriori argument because it relies on the natural world being a certain way and us observing it that way. If the natural world was not very complex at all, then Paley's argument would just seem ridiculous, and the world is not this way by its definition. His design argument is also inductive. It talks about all of the complex things we've seen in the past and says that what holds for them is likely to hold for complex natural objects like the human eye. There are also a posteriori arguments that are more abductive, or inferences to the best explanation. This is where a thinker suggests a given phenomenon either can only be explained by the existence of a divine being, or is best explained by that being. There are a very wide variety of these arguments all through philosophical and theological literature. A pretty famous one is the fine-tuning argument. This begins with the observation that the fundamental laws of the universe are so carefully calibrated to allow it to exist and support life in small sections of it. If the fundamental constants that tune the laws of physics were even slightly different, then we would never have existed, and indeed, nothing would have ever existed. Advocates of the fine-tuning argument suggest that the best way to explain this is that these values were set by a supremely intelligent and powerful agent, which sounds an awful lot like a god. Here, it's not like we've seen a lot of universes being created, so the inductive element is pretty understated. But nonetheless, it is certainly abductive and certainly a posteriori, since it argues that God is the best way to explain why the laws of the universe are as they observably are. Sometimes, an a posteriori argument draws from certain facts about us as humans. C.S. Lewis quite often gave arguments in this style. The two main examples of this in his writings are his argument from morality and his argument from desire. For the first one, Lewis initially observes the large amount of convergence on what we happen to consider right and wrong, and then argues that the best way to explain this is that there is an objective moral law that is in turn grounded in a theistic God. He makes a similar argument about our purported desire for God. He claims that in almost every human, we seem to have this longing for something that is beyond ourselves and higher than every individual person or set of people. Some people would call this a search for purpose or for objective meaning, but the important thing for Lewis is that it is a natural desire for something transcendent and eternal seeming. Then, he says, just like it would be very strange if we had thirst, but there was no way to quench that thirst with water, a natural desire for something divine suggests there is something that could, in theory, fulfill that desire. This is, again, an a posteriori argument, this time with one foot in induction and the other in abduction. You can spot an a posteriori argument for God because it will often start from some observable fact about the external world. They'll then usually compare that to some set of analogous observations and attempt an induction, or they will say that God is the best way to explain the existence of this particular phenomenon, or some mixture of both. Induction and abduction certainly aren't exclusive. A posteriori arguments also technically include arguments from personal revelation. This is where someone claims to have directly experienced an angel or some other divine being, and believes in God because of this particular event or set of events. Likewise, the scripture of many religions purport to record supernatural occurrences that would only really be explicable if there was some kind of God involved. If the prophet Elijah truly did soak his offering in water only for it to burst into flames when he prayed to God, then it is quite difficult to explain this without believing in God. This is part of what can make scripture so convincing for some people. If you think the events recorded are true, then belief in God is a perfectly natural consequence of this. The key to analysing a posteriori arguments is often, again, to look at their structure. As we said, most of the time they will start with some claim about the world, and then perhaps another one about analogous objects, and then posit either that we can infer God inductively or that God is the best explanation for the initial claim. For example, let's look at Paley's argument, this time in propositional form. 1. Many objects in the natural world are incredibly complex. 2. Almost all complex things have a designer. 3. Thus, we can conclude that the complex objects in the natural world have a designer. To criticize this argument, you could question the first premise, but most people do not. In fact, a lot of the critique of this argument is aimed at the second premise, that almost all complex things have a designer. Utilizing evolutionary theory, we point to all the complex things in the world that can come about through a mixture of probability and natural pressures. Thus, the inductive leap doesn't seem as substantiated. And in general, this is a very handy structure for your own critiques. You can either question one of the premises or suggest that God is not the best way to explain the premises. I'm using strength rather than the more technical logical term validity here because I want to include these inductive and abductive arguments which don't always have a straightforward deductive structure. For instance, to respond to Lewis's argument about our shared moral intuitions suggesting an objective moral law, which in turn suggests the existence of God, we could argue that shared moral intuitions are instead best explained by the fact that these are simply useful for constructing successful societies. Any societies without them just died out, and we are left with the ones that have them. After all, it's not hard to see how a society that's structured around indiscriminate murder and theft would have trouble surviving for a long time. But next, I want to turn to a religious argument that's becoming more and more popular in recent years, and one that I find totally fascinating. So let me introduce you to the pragmatic religious argument. 3. The utility of God. For an atheistic philosopher, Arthur Schopenhauer was in some ways a big fan of religious belief. For him, it was not that a belief in God was necessarily true, but rather that it served important societal functions and, incidentally, did teach certain philosophical truths that would otherwise go unknown to most people. For Schopenhauer, the world is not a fun place. There is an awful lot of suffering, and oftentimes that suffering seems completely pointless. He often raises the rather sensible question, what is the point of going on? But he thinks that for many people, religion does provide them with an answer to this question and thus stops them from falling into despair. They are told that while they will suffer and perish in this life, they will get heavenly rewards in the next. And for him, that fulfills an important societal function of allowing people to cope with hardship when it inevitably strikes, and slightly disguise what he took to be the unbearable pessimistic truth about the universe. In other words, Schopenhauer did not think that God exists, but he was worried about what might happen if everyone genuinely did stop believing in God. And although Schopenhauer was an atheist, a lot of religious thinkers also, unsurprisingly, tend to argue that religious faith is a good thing at a social level and that we have good, pragmatic reasons to believe alongside theological ones. A good example of this is the Russian writer Fyodor Dostoevsky, who thought that without a firm belief in God, we may begin to just treat one another as means to some selfish material end. For him, a belief in the soul and the forgiveness of sins and the spark of divinity in every individual person could, if genuinely enacted, turn the world into a place of unfettered brotherly love. He did not think that Christianity in his day was anywhere near this situation, but he was worried that they were losing ground in that battle. He feared that if we lost sight of the notion that every person was of infinite spiritual value, then we could begin to justify murder, violence, and rewriting morality to suit our own selfish needs. This is partly what he was alluding to through Ivan Karamazov's musings that without God, everything might be permitted. Importantly, Dostoevsky was not merely saying that it is fear of hell that keeps people moral. He was rather saying that it was certain beliefs about the metaphysical structure of the world that supported our moral code. Arguments like these are importantly different from the ones we've looked at so far in the video. For one thing, they don't argue that God exists, but merely that a belief in his existence is extremely pragmatically useful, either for individual fulfillment or for the health of a society. This means that their conclusion is technically not God exists, but rather believing that God exists is good in some way. So their scope is not ontological, but instead to do with belief. This is conceptually rather interesting, because it means that you can technically be an atheist and yet still subscribe to one or more of these religious arguments. Voltaire famously remarked that while he did not believe in God, he certainly hoped that anyone considering stealing from him did. I think this form of argument has become increasingly popular with the slow rise of so-called cultural Christianity. Very broadly, people subscribing to this position tend to say that while events like the resurrection did not take place, nonetheless there are real benefits to holding on to large swathes of Christian beliefs and Christian ethics. The general thought tends to be that even if Christianity is not true, as far as moral systems go, it is hardly the worst we could do. Especially if we home in on the loving thy neighbour and looking out for others in need aspects. Their worry is often that if we do abandon this system, then we may create a vacuum that allows another one to step into its place, and there is no guarantee that this replacement system won't be totally disastrous. It is very much a Chesterton's fence argument. The writer and apologist G.K. Chesterton used to argue that we should not knock down fences, either literal or metaphorical ones, until we know exactly what they are there for and what will happen if we remove them. Likewise, people in this vein argue that we should not try to dispense with Christian ethics until we are very sure about what will replace it. Another kind of pragmatic argument goes, while religions may or may not be true, we can certainly learn a lot from them. This, again, is a very atheist-friendly argument, and does not even say that believing in God is necessarily beneficial, but it does urge us to not throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. For example, while it is never quite clear to me what Jordan Peterson's position on the metaphysics of God is, he often does analyze religious texts in an attempt to draw certain lessons from them. I am currently partway through his newest book, and he has talked about what we can learn from the book of Exodus about resisting tyranny, and what we can learn from the book of Genesis about creation and language. Alan Watts arguably did a similar thing with many Buddhist texts. He often seemed less interested in what was metaphysically or ontologically the case, and more what practical lessons we can learn from a long tradition that has had a great many great minds put a lot of work into it. Schopenhauer makes a similar argument when he says religions can be used to teach allegorical truths about the world. So, for example, while he thought that fasting specifically in service to a god had no real divine element, he did think that detaching from material objects and learning to deal with frustrated desires was an invaluable skill, and that religions help to teach this skill through allegory. When analysing arguments like this, it's very important to pay careful attention to the particular conclusion that's being drawn. The mere idea that we can learn something from religious texts is probably true, but also it's a relatively minimal thing to show. And the plausibility of the conclusions will ultimately depend on which lessons are being drawn from the text. If someone is arguing that belief in God is necessary for living a fulfilling life, then the bar is much higher than if they are simply saying that such a belief might be helpful for some people. And if someone is arguing that religion in general, or a religion in particular, is good for society, then that is an empirical point that ultimately ought to be demonstrated either way. Pragmatic arguments about God stretch all the way from William James's point that you can choose to believe in God if you think you'll find it helpful, to Dostoevsky's worry that without Christ we will morally decay, so much so that he would rather be with Christ than with the truth, to use his words. If you do want to challenge arguments like this, then the first thing to point out is that demonstrating the utility of a belief in God is not the same thing as demonstrating the existence of a God. Funnily enough, this point is made just as often by die-hard believers as it is by atheists. Then, if you want to challenge the premises of the pragmatic argument directly, you can do this in a variety of ways depending on what they are. You might try to point to successful atheistic societies, or argue that morality can ultimately be held together by merely social contracts. You might suggest that the allegorical lessons of religion can be taught in other ways, like through great literature, which does not claim to be true, but can still definitely impart wisdom. You might argue that existential philosophy is one way to solve problems of meaning without God, or that belief in God is no guarantee that existential meaning will be found. After all, even the wisest man in the Bible, King Solomon, still had repeated crises of meaning. Again, like with the previous sections, I do want to point out that each of these points does in turn have counterpoints. I can't elucidate every possible direction each argument about religion could go in this video. But lastly, I want to turn to perhaps one of my favourite types of religious argument, and one that I think goes criminally undernoticed because it has a fascinating philosophical structure. 4. Religion and the Transcendental. The term transcendental argument comes from Kantian scholarship, and it refers to a particular type of argument structure which says Y exists and cannot exist without X, so X must also exist. In theory, these arguments could be primarily a priori or primarily a posteriori, though they normally involve some aspect of both. And personally, I think they deserve their own section, because they can get a bit fiddly and it's very easy to become confused when we're dealing with them. In very broad terms, the general idea here is to point to something we already believe is true, and then use that to show that something else must also be the case, since the thing that we initially think is true cannot exist without it. An example might help illustrate what I mean. One transcendental argument that can be traced all the way back to Kant argues that the external world must exist if we are to believe in the notion of experience. The chain of reasoning goes a little something like this. If we recognize what we have as experiences, then that only makes sense if we draw the distinction between things that are experiences and things that are not experiences. But this stuff that is not experience is basically what we mean when we talk about the external world. Thus, if experience exists, then the external world must also exist, since it is a precondition for that experience. It is this precondition framing that defines the transcendental argument. Before we get started, I want to draw a distinction between what I will call an ontological transcendental argument and a doxastic transcendental argument. Whereas an ontological transcendental argument purports to prove something's existence, a doxastic transcendental argument merely aims to prove that we are already committed to believing something. Doxastic here comes from the ancient Greek word doxasia, meaning belief. In some ways, this is a mirror of the distinction we drew in the last section between arguments that try to show that God exists and those which merely try to show that we ought to believe in him. One ontological transcendental argument comes from C.S. Lewis, who argued that if we are to have reason, there must be some non-material grounding being, which we call God. Effectively, he says that if there were only material things, then there would be no reasons, there would only be non-rational causes. And he says that no combination of non-rational causes can ever give rise to a reason. Thus, he says that there must be some non-material thing which grounds reason. And this thing that grounds reason and logic and ensures that it is veridical or that it tracks truth sounds an awful lot like the intelligent, metaphysically grounding being that Christians call God. Thus, Lewis attempts to infer from the existence of reason, which he takes to be self-evident, and at the very least most people would not want to deny, to the existence of something that looks quite godlike. I want to clarify here that Lewis's argument is more detailed than this. I'm just compressing it down for ease of presentation. He justifies his premises in much greater detail than I'm doing here. On the other hand, there are doxastic transcendental arguments, which argue that while atheists may say that they do not believe in God, they are in fact committed to a belief in God based either on other things that they do believe or just how they act. For example, I quite often come across arguments suggesting that if an atheist accepts that there are ways of being right and wrong, then they are implicitly committed to the existence of a God, even if they do not know it. And this argument would make sense if you thought that God was a necessary precondition of moral standards. Again, there's that necessary precondition component which makes this a transcendental argument. In the modern day, this argument has been popularized in non-academic discourse by Dr. Jordan Peterson, who is rather fond of saying that even if people claim to be atheists, they certainly do not act like it, because they still behave as if things are right, wrong, beautiful, true, or knowable, and he thinks that all of that depends on the prior belief in some kind of God. Personally, I find doxastic transcendental arguments rather interesting because they often rely on this distinction between what we say we believe and what beliefs are supposedly manifest in our actions. And this, in turn, raises a fascinating philosophical question. Just when can we infer from someone's actions to their beliefs, even against what they explicitly say? If I repeatedly claimed that I was absolutely certain that it was not going to rain, but then I also put on my raincoat and packed my umbrella, then most people would assume that whatever I say, I clearly do believe it's going to rain. Otherwise, I wouldn't have taken all of those precautions. However, it is also possible to be mistaken about this. Perhaps I do not think it's going to rain, but I happen to be playing the lead in a local production of Singing in the Rain, and this is my costume. It's just a little something for you to chew on when it comes to these sorts of arguments. Getting round this problem is one reason why it is rather important for those advocating for doxastic transcendental arguments that they establish that belief in God is a necessary precondition of the behavior or other belief. Otherwise, doubt tends to creep in, and also, I suppose, technically it then doesn't become a transcendental argument, but rather a more standard abductive one. Ultimately, most responses to transcendental arguments of either form challenge the claim that God or a belief in God is truly a necessary precondition to the initial starting point. For example, if we wanted to respond to Lewis, we might give a pragmatist account of reason where we suggest that reason does track truth because we have evolved to track truth, given that knowing what is true is very useful when it comes to surviving, except in a few interesting exceptional cases. We might think that veridical reason does not require an agential or personal God, but instead simply a way the universe is regularly organized. We might argue that the relationships of logic are best construed as just stipulated formalistic games, and then some of these games just happen to be really, really useful. If successfully argued, any one of these would break the chain of necessity that links the uncontroversial claim that reason exists to God's existence. Likewise, for doxastic transcendental arguments, we can challenge the idea that commitment to the initial action or belief does imply a belief in God. We might deny that God is necessary for ethics, or that a belief in ethics is necessary for ethical behavior. Again, this involves breaking the chain of necessity such that a belief in God can no longer be validly inferred from the premises of the argument. Additionally, you might argue that a belief could both be necessary to believe and yet also be false. If by some weird cosmic coincidence we were all hardwired to believe that there was a kraken at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, then that would not mean that there actually was one. It would just mean that we could not help but believe there is one. Transcendental arguments may be the trickiest type of argument in this video to examine, because it is sometimes very difficult to tell exactly what is necessary to believe certain things, or what is necessary for other things to exist. For instance, it is sometimes claimed that God is necessary for knowledge to exist, and yet there are plenty of atheistic philosophies of knowledge that seem to function very well. And without the theist going through each one and explaining why it is insufficient without God, it is very hard to see where the link of necessity comes in. I think in popular discourse, a leap is sometimes made that because God does ground important concepts like knowledge or reason or truth within certain religious frameworks, that means that nothing else could ground those things. In which case, a natural response is to then suggest alternative philosophical foundations for these concepts. Additionally, I want to note that sometimes a transcendental-looking argument is posited with the conclusion that God must exist, when the argument only really challenges the idea that just material things exist. I find this conflation of atheism and materialism happens quite a lot when people are discussing the necessary preconditions for certain beliefs or certain things. Even if a materialistic worldview cannot account for something, that doesn't necessarily mean that an atheistic worldview could not account for that thing. There are a whole host of atheistic philosophers that aren't materialists, and I think that the close link between materialism and atheism is more of an artifact of specifically new atheism than anything else. The point of this loose taxonomy of religious arguments is certainly not to be complete or exclusive. For instance, there are plenty of arguments that have some a priori premises and some a posteriori ones. But by sorting the arguments you encounter into these categories, it should give a helpful idea of how to understand them, build upon them, and, if you like, criticize them. And the best part is that these same argument structures are not just found in the philosophy of religion, but all across argumentation. But if you specifically want to explore some a posteriori arguments for belief in God, then click here to look at my discussion of David Hume's landmark text on religious argumentation from the natural world. I hope you enjoyed this video, and have a wonderful day.